Okay, hello everybody. I'm Richard Southwell, and I'd like to talk about a project which I've been working on. And the project is to do with how complex networks can evolve from simple rules. So this is joint work with Jianwei Huang, and me and Jianwei Huang are in the Chinese University of Hong Kong at the NCEL lab. And we also work with Chris Cannings, who's a mathematician from the University of Sheffield in the UK. So the basic idea behind this project is to see how complex networks can be generated via simple rules. And so I suppose the first thing I should talk about is what networks actually are. So a network is basically where you have a load of vertices, which you can basically think of as dots, and they're connected by some lines, which we call edges. And so there are lots of examples of real-world networks. I would say that in some sense, we can really be thought of as parts of networks. I mean, the social network, for example, has people as vertices, and a pair of those vertices will be linked if the corresponding people are friends. And so you can try and think about what the large social network is that has every single person in the world represented within it. Certainly that would be a very large and very complex network. And there are lots of other networks which we really kind of live inside. For example, the internet or the web, transportation networks and electrical networks. There are many of these large-scale complex networks that have huge influences on our lives. And in one way we can be thought of as living within networks, and also I would say that we can really be thought of in some sense as being made out of networks. You can think about things like regulatory systems, circulatory systems, nervous systems, neural networks, and protein-protein interaction networks, and things like that can really be considered to be types of networks which we are actually really kind of made out of. I mean, our organism or other organisms in biology can be considered to really be in some sense built out of different kinds of networks. And so, I mean, there are also many, many other examples of important networks in the world. Even things which are abstract, like networks of languages, which have different vertices representing different words and edges representing different kinds of relationships, like words having similar meanings or sounding similar or whatever. So anyway, I'd say in modern times there's an increasing realization that it's really important to try and understand what kinds of structures all these different networks have for many, many reasons. And so I think this has spurred people to develop lots of different kinds of models of complex networks. So I just want to give a brief outline of a few very influential models. So the first one is the Erdos-Renyi random graph model. This is quite an old idea, but I think it really kicked off the whole idea of network modeling. The idea behind the Erdos-Renyi graph model is just that you have a load of vertices, and then you randomly connect those vertices with some edges. I mean, it's really not much more sophisticated than that. I mean, more particularly, you set some probability, and then you link every pair of vertices independently with that probability. But basically, it's just that idea. Now, the Erdos-Renyi graph model was a very good thing because it inspired some very good mathematics, and it also gave network scientists a sort of starting point to start thinking about lots of very interesting things like what kinds of structures do social networks have and various different things like that. But in more recent times, there have been quite a few more sophisticated network growth models which have been proposed. A couple which stand out are the Watts-Strogatz small world model and the Barabasi-Albert preferential attachment model. Now, I'm not really going to talk about these kind of random graph models very much, but I'll just give you an outline since these things have had such a big impact on the development of network science. Basically, the Watts-Strogatz model involves taking some kind of very regular graph structure. Oh, by the way, graph is just another word for network. They're really synonyms. Okay, so the idea is that you take a very regular graph structure called a ring lattice, where every vertex pretty much looks the same as every other vertex, and then you do a little bit of random rewiring. So you unplug one end of some of the edges and plug them into somewhere else randomly, and then you get something which they call a small world graph. And such a thing tends to have features which are very similar to things observed in many different real world networks. Okay, and then the other thing is this Barabasi-Albert preferential attachment model. So the idea behind that is that you have some network structure and then you add vertices to it one at a time. And when you add a new vertex, that's going to form some connections with pre-existing vertices. And in particular, the probability of it forming a connection with a given pre-existent vertex is proportional to the number of connections that that pre-existent vertex already has. So think about, for example, if you join a new company, you're probably more likely to make friends with, to link up with, somebody in that company who already has more friends. Okay, so it's this kind of rich get richer style idea. Anyway, so these two models and various other probabilistic things that have been proposed have been very, very good for network science, and they've certainly helped to explain a lot of features of real-world complex networks. However, I think that there's definitely some way in which these models are unsatisfactory. I mean, in particular, complex networks are complex, and these models don't really explain why. I mean, yes, each of these systems does generate a complex network, but why? Well, they generate complex networks because they're based on randomness. I mean, each of these systems is really based on a random number generator. And for that reason, they don't really explain where the complexity comes from. They just kind of assume that the complexity is injected in from outside the system. And so that's one kind of, that's one reason to look at other things. Another important observation about network science and really about modelling in general is that people only really have an understanding of a very few different models. I mean, speaking of networks, there is really an infinite number of different network formation mechanisms. And certainly there's a lot of different network formation mechanisms which are relevant for our understanding of forms in the real world. And yet, there's only a very small number of these things which people have actually considered. Only a handful, really, of famous network development models. And so, I think that for this reason, it's kind of wise to at least examine an alternative approach to this kind of modelling. Rather than looking at these complex networks and trying to determine models which could generate them, how about just looking at the space of, I'll say all possible models. I mean, looking at the space of many, many different kinds of network formation models and just seeing what kind of forms those things generate. I think that this kind of approach is very refreshing, and by understanding what kinds of structures can be generated by models, particularly by simple models, we can really gain an understanding of what kinds of forms we might expect to see, as well as understanding how those things could be generated. Okay, so before I get into the details of this project, I'd like to make a couple of acknowledgements. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the work of Stephen Wolfram, and because I think that his book, A New Kind of Science, is really such a great book, and it's inspired a lot of the work that I've done. So the idea behind A New Kind of Science is to study the dynamics and the behavior of very, very simple programs. So rather than looking at the dynamics of predetermined rules, one does this kind of experimental approach where one looks at a space of many different kinds of systems, say cellular automata or string rewrite systems or whatever, and one just sort of examines what kinds of dynamics those systems can produce. You know, very small ones which are chosen quite arbitrarily. And this turns out to be absolutely fascinating because what one learns is that there is just a huge number of very, very simple kinds of programs or rules which can generate highly complex and unexpected dynamics. And Stephen Wolfram talks a lot about this and what the implications of this are. And for me, most importantly, he really gives a very good methodology for studying this phenomenon, which is really a very vast and important phenomenon which I think has passed by a lot of people for a long time. Anyway, another person who I think I'm really indebted to is Thomas O. Bolognesi, because he wrote a paper called Planar Trinet Dynamics with Two Rewrite Rules. And the idea behind this paper is that he studies systems where you have a network structure and you have a kind of writer which moves around on the network structure and changes it according to deterministic rules. And so really, what Thomas O. Bolognesi works on is really very similar to what I worked on, and I drew a lot of inspiration from his paper. Really, as far as the ultimate concept goes, I think I'm very indebted to him. I would say that the systems which we consider are perhaps simpler and maybe easier to visualize, and I'd say that I do a bit more mathematics perhaps than he does, but really as far as the original concepts go, I think, I'm indebted to him greatly. Okay, so that's all the kind of introduction done with. Now I want to talk about the actual models. So this is the basic idea. We have a writer, and it moves around on the network, and it applies rewrite rules as it goes. So let me just show you. Here's the thing running, okay? Oops. Alright then. So now I'm going to back up and explain. So this is the initial network. We always start from this network. It's a cube, and notice how the edges are coloured. They're coloured red, blue, and green. And they're coloured in such a way that no two edges with the same colour are touching each other. And so our networks are always coloured in this way. And we also always have this property that every vertex has three edges incident upon it. So every vertex has a red edge, a blue edge, and a green edge touching it. This is the kind of networks which we are considering. And at the top of our systems, we picture the rules behind how they run. So these things here at the top, these are the rules behind the system. And you can think of these as rewrite rules, which show how a piece of network should be replaced, or you can think of them as instructions, which say how the writer should behave and how it should change the network around itself and move. Basically, the idea is that at any given time step, you look which of these four different kinds of surroundings the writer has, and then you apply the appropriate operation. And that operation is going to involve perhaps some kind of structural modification and some kind of movement of the writer. So let's just go through this slowly. So this is the initial network. Now we want to find the network on the next time step. So how do we do that? Well, we look at the writer, we look at its surroundings, and we say, okay, the writer's not part of a triangle, and so its surroundings correspond to this case here. And so we apply this rewrite rule here. So what does this rule say? Well, this rule says replace the writer vertex with a triangle and move the writer along a blue edge. And so that's what we do. And then this is the network on the next time step. And the idea is that we do this kind of operation over and over again, and we just see how the system evolves. That's basically all there is to it. So again, we'll look at the writer, and again, its surroundings correspond to this form here. So we apply this rule here. We replace the writer's position with a triangle and move it along a blue edge. And now we see that actually the writer's surroundings are different. It's now part of a triangle. And so what are we going to do now? Well, we have to see which of these different cases the writer's surroundings now correspond with. And one can see that there's actually a blue edge linking the writer's neighbours now. And so the writer's surroundings actually correspond to this case here. And so when we update this system, we're just going to apply this rule here. And this means we're not going to change the network, but we're just going to move this writer here over a red edge. And so that's what we do. And this structure here is the network on the next time step. Okay, so now what do we do? Well, now we can see that the writer's surroundings correspond to this case here, with the green edge linking the writer's neighbours. And so we'll apply this operation here. What does this operation say? It says just keep the network fixed. It says don't move the writer and don't change the network. And so this is actually a fixed point. And so this network is not going to change anymore. And so in this case, the evolution is effectively halted. Okay, so this isn't the most exciting system in the world, but the point is that just by changing these little rules slightly, we can actually see some immensely complex dynamics. And I'm going to talk about that kind of thing later. But I just wanted to show you a very simple example. So in this project, we investigated the dynamics of many different kinds of rules. And what I'm trying to show with this picture here is a kind of I'm trying to show all the space of all different rules which we investigated. And so any given rule is specified by associating each of these four different possible surroundings that the writer can have with something that happens when the writer has those surroundings. For example, if we associate this with this, it means that when there is a red edge linking the writer's neighbours, we just move the writer along a red edge. Okay? And so there's actually 3,888 rules specified in this way, because there's 12 ways that we can associate this first kind of surroundings with something, and there's 18 ways we can represent this second kind of surroundings with something, and 18 ways we can associate this third kind of surroundings with something, and one way we can associate this last kind of surroundings with something. So essentially, we explored the space of all different possible rules which involve potential triangle replacements and movement of the writer over up to 2 coloured links. So the writer can only move a distance of at most 2 during a given update, with really one notable exception, which is that we suppose that whenever there's a green edge linking the writer's neighbours, we don't do any action. Okay? So we make that constraint because, number one, we want to reduce the number of rules we have to consider, so we can do a complete exploration. And number two, we want our rules to be as simple as possible so that we can really identify the minimalistic cases which generate particular kinds of behavior. So, okay, this leads to a set of 3,888 adaptive graph rules. So what? Well, what we did was to use various different techniques, experimental, statistical, mathematical, to classify these different rules. In particular, we classify their behavior. So we're really trying to just see what kinds of things these different rules can do. So that's what I'm going to talk about. So the first kind of behavior that you see generated by these kind of systems is fixed points. I've already talked about one rule which generates a fixed point. And here's another example. This is actually the rule which generates the largest fixed point. Okay? So out of all the 3,888 rules, when you run them from the cube, this one here generates the largest fixed point. So now I'm showing you the rule evolving. You'll notice here that the way this network's been drawn is different to the way I drew the last network. I'm using a different kind of network drawing mechanism here that I developed myself. But, you know, in a network, the only thing that matters is how the vertices are linked together. And it's really a matter of art or style, how you actually lay out the vertices in space. Actually, it's generally quite a challenging problem to draw the vertices in the right way so that people can see the important features of the network. Anyway, so this network's now reached a fixed point. I told you it would reach a fixed point, and it takes 26 time steps to do it. And this is actually the largest static network that you can generate out of this set of rules when you evolve from the cube. So it's quite difficult to see here, but the reason that this network is halted is because now the surroundings of the writer are like this. And as I've already said, all of the different rules which we consider involve this kind of feature that when these kind of surroundings are realized, the network halts. And so in fact, quite a lot of our rules actually reach fixed points for exactly this reason. Okay, so out of the 3,888 rules, we actually have that 2,918 of them reach fixed points. So that's a large fraction of all of our rules. That's about 75% of all of them. And the reason that so many of our rules end up reaching fixed points when we evolve from the cube is because they all have this kind of feature that they stop, that they halt whenever these kind of surroundings are realized. Now the system I just showed you generates the largest fixed network, which has 56 vertices. And now I want to show you the system which takes the longest amount of time to reach a fixed point. I'm just trying to show you the extreme cases here. So here it is running. I've got this video of it here. Okay, so now this network has become fixed. That took 34 updates, and this network has 52 vertices, so it's not quite as big as the last one, but it takes longer to run. And in this network, the network isn't going to change anymore now, but the writer is going to continue to move. And you can see that by looking at these kind of rules. You see, this rule says that when the writer has a blue edge linking its neighbours, it moves along this blue edge linked to it. And so the writer's just going to kind of move up and down on this blue edge in the middle of this kind of bow tie shape here. for the rest of eternity. And so this basically shows us that there are actually two different kinds of so-called fixed points. So I'm going to define a rule as reaching a fixed point when there comes a time after which the network structure doesn't change anymore. Well, there are the so-called static writer fixed points, like the last one I showed you, where the whole thing stops moving, including the writer. And there are also things like this, these dynamic writer fixed points, where the network stops growing, but the writer keeps moving. So another question you can ask is, are there any of these fixed points where the writer moves around with high period, or where the writer sort of has a large arc of movement? And the answer to that is no. Each of these mobile writer fixed points has the writer either moving with period 2 or period 4. Fixed points really are the very simplest kinds of behavior that our systems can generate. And the next most interesting kind of behavior is something which I call repetitive growth. So what's repetitive growth? Well, basically the idea is that the network continues to grow forever, but the writer sort of gets trapped within a particular part of the network, and it keeps generating the same structure around itself over and over again. And in fact, the type of structure that the writer develops induces it to keep making more structure of the same kind. Okay, so here's a very simple example. I think this is actually one of the simplest examples of repetitive growth. We see that, so this is the system evolving over the first 1, 2, 3, 4 updates. And on the first update, the network just replaces its vertex with a writer. But then its surroundings look like this. And so obviously it applies this kind of rewrite rule. But the thing is that after this rewrite rule has been applied, if you look at the writer's surroundings, they actually look exactly the same. And so, of course, the writer's just going to apply this rewrite rule again and again and again. And the sort of net effect of this is that the writer's going to stay in the same kind of relative place and just keep extending out this long kind of ladder shape structure here. Well, okay, so this is what I call period 1 repetitive growth. And if you want a rigorous definition, you can say that period P repetitive growth occurs at time t when there is some integer r, some natural number r, such that firstly we need to have the network growing forever, okay? We want to avoid the thing being fixed, so the network has to grow forever. And there's this integer r such that the network induced on the vertices within a distance r of the writer at time t looks the same as the network induced on the vertices within a distance r of the writer at time t plus p, and during the interval of time between t and t plus p, the writer never wanders a distance of r or more away from its position at t. So to put it in more down to earth terms, the idea is that you can kind of construct a bubble or a generalized sphere around the writer, and the writer never wanders outside of that bubble during this crucial interval, which is sort of defining the period of the growth here. And this kind of since the writer never wanders outside this bubble, its behavior is entirely dependent on the structure within the bubble. But it has the same, it sees the same kind of bubble around itself at time t plus p, and we'll say that p is minimal with respect to all these properties. And that gives us a kind of rigorous definition of this fairly intuitive idea of repetitive growth. So here is something with period 1 repetitive growth. Here is something with period 2 repetitive growth. So this is the network on time steps 6, 7, and 8 shown going downwards here. And if you look at the writer over here on the left, you can see that this is period 2 repetitive growth because the writer's surroundings are kind of oscillating between these two different types here, just by nature of the rules. So while the network keeps growing, the surroundings of the writer are periodically changing. Okay. So actually a really good way to spot repetitive growth is to do one of these plots here. So let me explain a little bit about this. The thing is that when you evolve these systems in a computer, you have to associate numbers to the vertices, or at least that's the normal way to do it. And so when you do that, you have to think of some kind of indexing scheme, you see, because when you replace a vertex with a triangle, you have to think, how are you going to index those newly generated vertices? And so the scheme which I settled upon was that when you replace a vertex with a triangle, you give the vertex with the red external edge the same index as its parent vertex here, which got replaced, and you give the vertices of this triangle, of this new triangle, which have the blue external edge and the green external edge, indices L plus 1 and L plus 2, where L is the number of vertices in the graph before the replacement operation. So this is just the indexing scheme which I used, but it's fairly simple, and there's some good spin-off from that. Because the thing is, if you just plot what the index is of the writer over time, that plot is actually extremely revealing if you use a nice simple indexing scheme like this. That kind of plot is extremely revealing about what kinds of dynamics are actually occurring within the system. For example, here, you can see that the differences between the writer's indices over time is becoming periodic with period 2. And that really tells us that this system, or at least it indicates that this system is in a period 2 repetitive growth process. Okay, so 840 of our rules generate repetitive growth. And the vast majority of those, 836 of them, really have, in a way, quite dull dynamics. They settle into their repetitive growth very quickly, within 20 time steps, and their repetitive growth has very low period, less than 7. But there are 4 extremely notable exceptions, and I want to talk about some of those. Okay, so this rule here actually has some of the most interesting and surprising behaviour out of anything in our set of 3,888 different rules. And so just watch the writer evolve within this system. This is one of those which generates repetitive growth, but unlike the other ones, this doesn't enter into repetitive growth quickly at all. In fact, for thousands of time steps, the writer just seems to keep moving around in a really very random looking way. And I mean, just try and predict how the writer's going to move, or how the network's going to change. I expect you'll have a very difficult job. And so, as I say, there were 836 of the rules with repetitive growth, which had very simple behaviour. And then this is one of the other 4. So there are these other 4 rules which have very, very long transients. And in fact, this is one of them, and another one of them is symmetrically equivalent to this one. And so there are 2 others, and they turn out also to be kind of mirror images of each other under the swapping of the roles of the red and blue edges. So really there are two fundamentally different kinds of very interesting rules which end in repetitive growth, and this is one of them. So let me show you a few more details about this rule. So here I have pictured a few of the important features of this rule. On the left here, this is a kind of snapshot of the development of a system, and I'm using these black arrows here to show the path that the writer has taken over the last few time steps. And by looking at this, you can see that it really seems as though on these early stages, this writer is moving in a rather unpredictable way. At the bottom here, I've given a plot of the index of the writer over time. And from this, you can see that over the first 5,000 or so time steps, the writer looks like it's moving around in a very unpredictable kind of pseudo-random way. And then suddenly, something happens. In fact, after 4,994 time steps, the system suddenly starts to do repetitive growth. And it's not even very simple repetitive growth. The system actually has a period of 454. And so it suddenly starts engaging in period 454 repetitive growth. I mean, I find that very surprising. Look how simple this rule is. And we initiate our system from a cube. So really there's the initial conditions in the rule are very, very simple. And yet somehow this system's able to evolve in its own way for thousands of time steps and then suddenly switch the mode of its behavior. Okay, so here on the right, this network is a snapshot of the network on time step 7,000. Okay, so you can see this kind of complicated structure on the left. This was generated during the earlier time steps when the repetitive growth hadn't set in yet and the writer was still moving around in a complex way. And you see this large handle structure developing on the right. This is really a symptom of the repetitive growth. I mean, the writer is over there on the right, and it's just keeping generating these sort of serially repeating parts, making this handle bigger and bigger. I'd like to say here that I find these systems quite reminiscent of the development of plants. I mean, when you drop a seed in the ground, the initial development process is that various different roots and things come out, and the structure around the seed is initially complicated. And then after that's happened for a while, a long kind of one-dimensional serial or repeating structure, as in the stalk of the plant, will grow up. And so I think there's something kind of similar going on here. We start with a very simple little cube, and then the structure around the cube is initially complicated, and after that's happened for a while, we get this long kind of one-dimensional structure developing out, kind of like the shoot of a plant. So as I've already said, there's really just two fundamentally different kinds of these rules with repetitive growth that have long transients and interesting behavior. Now I've just talked about one, this is the other one, so let me start it running. I think that this rule is actually more interesting than the other one. I think it's more complicated, I think that the structure it makes is more interesting, and I think that the timescales involved here are more extreme. I mean, this system, again, if you look at the writer, it seems to be moving around in a very complicated way. And this kind of complicated early transience lasts for an immense 17,615 time steps. Again, just evolving from the cube, just with these very simple rules. And then, suddenly, after this system has run for a long time, it starts on doing repetitive growth. But it's not simple repetitive growth. The repetitive growth itself has a period of 1,355. So, to be quite honest, it took a lot of computer work to even detect that this system was doing repetitive growth. And so, I think there are a few lessons to be learned from this. Firstly, when a system like these adaptive graph models appears to be engaging in some kind of complex behavior, that doesn't mean that that behavior is going to persist forever. And in fact, it can really be very difficult to determine what's going to happen in the future. I mean, there are other systems which seem like they're behaving in a complex way for the first million time steps or so, but how do we know whether their behavior is going to switch modes sometime in the very, very distant future? So that's one thing. Another thing is just in general that when one's studying these kind of simple programs, I think that having an open mind and not making any assumptions about what kinds of behavior are going to occur is very important, because without taking a very scientific attitude towards studying things like this, I would have never detected these kind of behavior. It's only really by sort of ignoring all my guesses about what would happen and just exploring the space in a very kind of automatic way that I was able to find this kind of surprising behavior. Okay, so now I've talked about fixed points and repetitive growth, I'd like to talk about the third and final mode of behavior which was observed when we looked at these systems, and that is what I call elaborate growth. Now, as far as a mathematical definition goes, I can just say that a system has elaborate growth when it's not a fixed point and when it's not repetitive. Okay, so all the rest of the rules automatically fall into this class. But it turns out that these rules with what I call elaborate growth, in quotation marks, do have some features. They do have things in common with each other. In particular, of course, the network grows forever, but the writer tends to move in a kind of one-dimensional fashion. Okay, so there's 130 of these different rules which exhibit elaborate growth, and this one running here, this is probably the simplest, and you can see that the writer is going around and around in circles. So a circle is a one-dimensional object, so the writer is really moving along a kind of one-dimensional track. So one thing we can ask is, why is the writer doing this? And actually, if you just look at these rules, you can really kind of prove that the writer is just going to keep going around and around this cycle. The thing is that if we look at the rules, you can notice that whenever the writer moves, its movement can be expressed as a combination of traversals of red or blue edges. Do you see that? And that's actually very important, because what that means is that essentially the writer must be confined to a one-dimensional track. What do I mean? Well, the thing is that in each of these networks with this kind of edge coloring scheme which we employ, they have a special feature, and that is that if you start at any vertex and then you go over a red edge and then a blue edge and then a red edge and then a blue edge, etc., then eventually, well, you're going to have to come back to where you started from. In other words, in more technical words, there is a unique cycle whose edges alternate between colours red and blue, which passes through each vertex, any particular vertex. So given a vertex, there's a unique alternating cycle which goes through that vertex. And this is really important, because when the writer's movement can be expressed in terms of going over these edges of two alternating colours, that means it's always going to be confined to that cycle. Okay, so that's why the movement of this writer looks kind of one-dimensional. But actually, there's a lot more going on in this rule. And in general, some of these systems with what I call elaborate growth are kind of hard to understand. But this is a really good case study, because one can really see a lot of interesting things by looking at this system mathematically. Firstly, I can give quite a nice verbal description of these rules, okay? So you can describe the rules like this. If there are no red edges and no green edges linking the writer's neighbours, then the update consists of moving the writer across a red edge and then a blue edge, and then replacing the writer's previous position, with a triangle. And otherwise, the update consists of not changing the structure at all. Okay? And so in this case, in fact, it turns out that every single time step, our update just consists of putting down a triangle and moving along a red edge and then a blue edge. So the dynamics of this system are really simple. And basically this writer just keeps going around and around in circles. But what are the kind of large-scale effects of this kind of activity? Well, in fact, they turn out to be quite easy to summarize. If you look at this network, you might notice that there's quite a lot of self-similarity there. You can kind of see there's a kind of fractal structure emerging. And in fact, it turns out that each complete traversal that this writer makes around this circuit, the kind of operations that the writer does during that traversal basically corresponds to a kind of global operation. In other words, the kind of net effect of the writer's work is to essentially apply a kind of global simultaneous rewrite operation. Okay, so here's a kind of one-dimensional representation of the dynamics I've just shown you. And so successive rows of this picture correspond to the relevant part of the network on successive time steps. I don't want to go into too many details here. You can see the paper for the mathematical details. But this is just to show you that basically this system can be reduced to a kind of something like a string rewrite system with very simple dynamics. But this is really the important theorem if you're interested in understanding the kind of structure which develops. And basically what it says is this. It says that every complete traversal that the writer makes around this kind of circuit, it just keeps going round and round, it basically achieves this kind of operation where we replace every triangle with this funny shape here. So for example, to go from the network on time step 2 to the network on time step 6, we just apply this rewrite operation here globally to every triangle. So we apply it to this triangle, and we apply it to this triangle, and we get this, the network on time step 6. And then if we want to find out the network on time step 14, again, we just apply this operation to each triangle present on time step 6 simultaneously. Here I've written the same thing out in words. And basically, this shows you how you can find the network on time step 2 to the n plus 1 minus 2, given the network on time step 2 to the n minus 2. And why do I say the network present on these special times? Well, it just happens that these are the special times when the writer has sort of fully traversed an orbit. And these are powers of 2 because every time the writer traverses an orbit, it essentially doubles the length of that orbit because it lays down loads more structure that it has to walk around again next time it goes around the orbit. And so an important lesson about these rules of elaborate growth is that effectively a system like this can achieve a rather different operation than what it seems to be doing. I mean, it seems as though only one little bit of the network has been modified every time step, but we saw in the last example that the writer was going around and around, and each complete traversal corresponded to a kind of global rewrite operation. And so essentially what was happening was that a very different kind of computation was effectively being performed over a kind of longer time span. Anyway, now I want to talk about another one of these rules with elaborate growth. And in some ways it has similar features to the last example that I just showed you. In particular, the writer, once again, goes around and around in circles, pretty much. And once again, the writer's movement is constrained to traversals over red and blue edges. So this kind of proves that the writer movement is effectively one-dimensional. And so the writer goes around and around, and again, a kind of structure which looks quite fractal is generated. Now, there's an important feature of these networks which I haven't really talked about so far, but it's about growth rates. You see, apart from the fixed points, all of these rules have growth rates which are at least approximately linear. What do I mean? I mean that the number of vertices grows as something which is approximately a linear function of time. Okay? And that happens for good reason. I mean, generally, the number of vertices generated on one over a large number of time steps, the average number of vertices generated is quite similar. And so we get this approximately linear growth. But the thing is that the actual growth rate of some of our rules can really be quite complicated. And this is an example. You see, the best linear fit of the number of vertices over time, at least over the first 100 time steps, is that the number of vertices is approximately 9.25 plus 1.38 times the number of time steps elapsed. And so that's a pretty good linear fit. It gets you pretty much almost within one of the actual number of vertices. But what's interesting here is that the way the actual number of vertices deviates from this best linear fit really looks quite complicated, and this is evident from this plot here. And so this is quite interesting because it seems like there's evidence that there's some kind of complicated process afoot. And so I got very interested in this, and I tried to understand exactly what is the growth rate of this rule and what's going on here. And after rather a lot of analysis, I was able to reduce this system to a one-dimensional string rewrite system that, for those of you who know about such things, is basically a kind of Fibonacci string rewrite system. And it turned out that I was able to derive an exact formula for the number of vertices, and here it is. So this is the number of vertices at time step t, and this symbol here, this is phi. It means the golden ratio, which is a very special number, 1 plus the square root of 5, all divided by 2. And so it's quite remarkable that such a simple formula ends up generating this quite complex form. And it's also very nice, I think, that the golden ratio appears here, because the golden ratio is really a very important and, in my opinion, almost magical number, which appears to describe many kinds of things within mathematics, science, and art. Okay, so now I want to talk about another one of these rules, which has elaborate growth. And this is quite similar to the two I've talked about before, in the sense that the writer goes around and around in circles and is essentially confined to a one-dimensional track. But this rule is quite remarkable because it actually has what seems to be an incredibly complicated growth rate. You see, again, if you try and do a linear fit to a number of vertices, you see a really very complicated looking deviation from the best between the number of vertices and its best linear fit. And you know, this is the deviation shown over the first 1,000 time steps, and you can plot the deviation over the first 100,000 time steps or whatever, and it just really looks like it's very, very complicated. I've done lots of different kinds of analysis on this rule, and it looks like there's something highly complex going on. There's also some evidence of some kind of nested structure or fractals, and so it might be possible to crack this system. I'm sure that it can be reduced to a one-dimensional strings rewrite system, which is good news, because once you can bring a rule into that kind of territory, you can bring a lot of well-known analysis techniques to bear on it. But I can't say that I've cracked this system, and I'd say that it's still really an open problem as to whether an exact description of the dynamics of this system can be derived or not. My suspicion is that they cannot. I think that there's probably some fundamentally irreducible complexity here. There are 130 of these rules which produce elaborate growth, and 104 of those cases have this kind of cyclic writer movement, which is similar to the cases I've already discussed. In fact, quite a lot of those 104 rules are kind of symmetrically equivalent to the things I've already discussed. Anyway, there's also another kind of behavior which I call bouncing writer movement, and so this rule exhibits that. Basically, the idea is that once again the writer is confined to a one-dimensional track, but this time rather than the writer going around and around in circles, the writer kind of goes backwards and forwards and bounces off a particular piece of the network and changes direction. In this case here, at the bottom here, this red edge, it acts kind of like a wall that a writer bounces off and then changes direction. Unlike the previous examples, where the writer was confined to walking around on red and blue edges, in this case the writer is confined to red and green edges, but that's just a difference in colours. It's not really very physically relevant. And in many ways, the way this system evolves is quite similar to some of the things we've seen before. We have the one-dimensional writer movement. Also, the network generated is rather fractal, and in fact, the global effects that the writer achieves within a traversal of its expanding one-dimensional track is essentially the same as what can be achieved by applying a global rewrite operation to many different pieces of the network simultaneously. Let me show you more about that. So basically, the story behind this rule with bouncing writer movement is rather similar to the story behind the first rule I showed you, which showed elaborate growth. In particular, each traversal that a writer makes, it effectively performs some global rewrite operations. The details here are slightly more involved, because these operations are only applied, in this case, to the vertices which are not on the outside face of this cube. You see that these four vertices on the outside never get touched by anything. But essentially, to go from the network on this special time step to the next special time step, one applies these rewrite rules globally to each vertex which is not one of the four outside corners of this cube. And so essentially we have the same kind of thing as before, that the writer's moving around on a kind of expanding one-dimensional track, and with successive traversals the writer is effectively performing these global rewrite operations. Okay, so that pretty much concludes my discussion of the 3,888 different rules. I just want to summarize now. So we managed to break these rules into three different classes. Those were fixed points, repetitive growth, and elaborate growth. The fixed points had two subclasses. There were fixed points where the writer ended up being static, and there were fixed points where the writer ended up moving. And then, similarly, the repetitive growth also had two subclasses. There were the rules which quickly went into repetitive growth, and then there were those other, well, effectively two special cases which had extremely long transients, and I think in many senses one could describe the behaviour of those two rules as complex. I mean, this certainly seems similar to things like cellular automata rule 110 and Langton's ants, which had this similar kind of feature of long-lasting pseudo-random behaviour followed by transition to some kind of repetitive behaviour. And then finally we had these systems of elaborate growth, and most of those basically ended up being things which generated nested structures, and they all seem to have this feature of the one-dimensional writer movement. And again, the rules with elaborate growth could be broken into two subclasses, which are the cyclic writer movements and the bouncing writer movements. So there we have it. That's the classification of all of these rules. I think it's quite interesting to do this because there are so many different systems out there. It's quite easy to get. I spent quite a long time just looking at randomly selected systems, and that was very interesting. But I think one gains a lot from doing a very systematic study. But certainly, if one looks at more general systems, one finds other kinds of very interesting phenomena which do not appear here. For example, in each of the rules which we considered so far, we had this constraint that when we had these kind of surroundings here, with a green edge linking the writer's neighbours, the system becomes fixed. When we drop that constraint and we allow rules with 4 active parts, we can see other kinds of behaviour. And this rule here is a particularly notable example. This is quite similar to those 2 rules with long transients and long period repetitive growth I discussed before, in the way that it looks. I mean, it looks like the writer is moving around in a kind of pseudo-random way for a very long time. But what's interesting here is that, so far as I can tell, it doesn't look like the system is ever becoming periodic or engaging in repetitive growth. As far as I can tell, the system just seems to be continuing in this kind of pseudo-random way forever. I'm going to show you a movie of this. Okay, so here is this rule running, this rule with 4 active parts, and just look about how the writer seems to be moving. See if you can guess how it's going to move. Basically, in my opinion, the writer seems to be moving in a very, very complex and hard to predict way. And I really haven't seen any way to find regularities in this kind of behaviour. And moreover, the network being generated here is very, very complex. I mean, the initial condition is the cube, just like always. And the rule here is not, it's really just about as simple as all the other rules we considered. But for some reason, the behaviour here is really quite immensely complex. And I think it's quite remarkable, especially when one considers what we observed before with the other rules which have the long transients followed by the long period repetitive growth. Because the thing is that this system may eventually settle into repetitive growth. I've run the thing for 500,000 time steps on my computer, and I've done statistical analysis, and in that time period the system does not engage in repetitive growth. But who knows, maybe on time step 1 million or 1 billion or 1 trillion or whatever, the system does start doing repetitive growth. Maybe it never does. Maybe it continues in this kind of random way forever. I think that this is one of those interesting questions that one finds when one takes this kind of simulation-based approach to studying complex networks. One can run into these kind of problems that really look almost undecidable, really. I'd say that this problem is just beyond the power of my computer or my mathematical methods. I don't know how this rule is going to run. Okay, now, so far, I've just been talking about the rather limited kind of rules where the only kinds of operations we are allowed to do are the only kind of structural modifications we're allowed to make are replacing vertices with triangles. Now, of course, there's lots of more complicated structural modifications that you can make to graphs. And so a good question then is, what kinds of things can happen if you allow more general kinds of rewrite rules? So here's an example of a more general rule. This rule involves not replacing a vertex with a triangle, but replacing a triangle with a vertex, kind of shrinking these three vertices together. And this rule has extremely simple dynamics, and it immediately goes into this period 2 orbit. But this is a kind of behavior which we haven't seen so far, because in the rules we've considered so far, the number of vertices never decreases with time. But here it does, and here we have this kind of thing where the shape of the network is oscillating in time. So, in fact, one can find much more elaborate versions of this kind of behavior if one looks at various different kinds of generalized rules. Another type of behavior one sees is systems with sublinear growth rates. And so, when one allows things like these triangle shrinkage rules, one can find systems like this which have behavior similar to things that we've seen before, but growth rates which are sublinear. Often these kind of growth rates tend to look like square root functions with time, something like that. And one can also consider other kinds of rules. For example, these rules here involve the so-called exchange operation, which in this context basically corresponds to replacing a triangle with a square. And when we look at rules like that, again, that opens the door to new kinds of behavior. And I find this rule particularly interesting because of the kind of network it generates. You see, actually it's something I haven't discussed so far, but a kind of interesting feature of these networks is what kind of space they generate. For example, one can associate space with dimension. Stephen Wolfram discusses this in A New Kind of Science. The idea would be that, for example, in geometry, in two-dimensional space, the area of a circle grows like the radius of that circle squared. It's pi r squared. And so, more generally, in d-dimensional space, the kind of hypervolume of a hypersphere grows like r to the power of d. And so one can look at a kind of generalization of that idea to networks. I mean, you can make a kind of generalized sphere around a vertex just by considering all the vertices which are within a distance d of that vertex. And one can see how the number of vertices in such a generalized sphere of radius r, such a set of vertices within a distance r of the thing you're interested in, you can see how the number of things in such a generalized sphere increases with r. And if it increases like r to the d, then you can say that, or sometimes you can say that the network can be thought of as having dimension d. This is the idea in a nutshell. Anyway, so I had a look at what kinds of dimensions the interesting spaces were, which were generated by some of the previous rules. And most of them had dimensions between 1 and 2.5. But this network here has really a very different kind of thing going on. Because within this system, when you grow the network very large, the number of vertices within a given distance of a vertex actually grows exponentially with the radius. So it doesn't grow like r to the d. It grows more like d to the r, or some number to the r. And that's kind of interesting. And in fact, this sort of points out the possibility that this is actually generating network which has curvature, network which has negative curvature. And so in a sense, one can think of this kind of network as generating something like hyperbolic space. I don't want to go into too many details. I don't want to make this lecture too long. Yes, so basically, if you look at the paper, you can see that I did some statistical tests on this, and according to some well-acknowledged measures, the network generated by this rule has a large-scale negative curvature. Anyway, so finally, I just want to conclude with some of these networks which I found, which generate forms which seem very similar to some real-world objects. So in each case, the networks I show were just evolved from a cube using the rules shown, and the pictures were generated using either spring embedding drawing mechanism or electrical spring embedding. These are very typical drawing mechanisms. But one can find a lot of different networks which have great similarity to real-world objects. These are telescopium seashells which have been sliced. This is a necklace, and my favourite, the turtle shell. And so I'd like to think that there's some kind of similarity within these kind of networks generated to these real-world objects. Certainly, I think it's an interesting thing which I wish to do in the future, to actually see if there's any kind of real developmental processes which can be emulated not just within their output, but within their kind of intermediate dynamics, and to see if any of these systems really grow like natural biological systems. Okay, so just to conclude then, I'd say that the study of these systems is still very much in its infancy. And the thing is that, especially when one looks at more general rules, one can find so many amazing and interesting complex kinds of behavior that it's really difficult to know what kinds of questions to ask. But one thing I'm really interested in doing is trying to find some real-world applications to these kind of systems. So these pictures suggest that one possible application could be modeling. And then there's other kinds of things, like I think there are definite similarities between these systems and things like brains or databases, which really change their form and connectivity to store data. And so it's interesting whether any kinds of novel and useful computations can be performed by these kinds of systems as well. And then another thing is, can these systems actually be used to generate space, which is physically useful? I mean, could some kind of weaving or construction mechanism be based on some kind of simple rules like this? I mean, certainly one could create some kind of nanobots or even a real robot which pulls itself out around on chains, which could achieve these very simple rules. And if any of the structures generated by these systems had good physical properties, like they were very strong or whatever, then that could be a very useful thing. So just to summarize, the study of these systems is still very much in its early days, and I think there's been a lot of emphasis on complex systems like cellular automata and string rewrite systems and things like this. But I think that these kind of adaptive graph models really deserve more attention, because honestly, almost everything that people are concerned with is based around the idea of space. And these kind of adaptive graph models are really teaching us what kinds of spaces can be generated by very simple computational processes. And surely understanding that is going to be useful for lots of different aspects of the real world. I'm Richard Southwell. Thanks for your attention.